Good evening. This is Pastor Randy Conley here at Joy Lutheran Church on the, what is today?
Second.
The second. No, it's got to be at least
It's the third.
Third, yes. On the 3rd of November, 2022, we are on Unit 5 of the Crossway's Bible Discovery class, and I welcome you. If you were not able to be here on this Thursday night at 7 p.m., then you can have this recording to catch up. One of the things I'd like to start with this evening is that our author wrote a very interesting prayer, and it's in the workbook for tonight's Unit 5. And I would invite you to join me as I read and pray this prayer written by Dr. Wendt. God of creation and Lord of history, we thank and praise you for revealing to us your good and gracious will for time and eternity. As you gathered the patriarchs and matriarchs into your forgiven community, so you have gathered us into your forgiven family. Remind us at all times that as you use the patriarchs and matriarchs to form a people for mission, you call us to perpetuate that mission. As we study the frailties of your Old Testament people, grant us insight to see what they were like, and the honesty to see what we are like. We thank you for making us your own in forgiving grace, for assuring us that you have prepared an eternal promised land for us, and for opening our eyes to see that we, your sons and daughters, are blessed beyond measure. We ask all of this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, the great I Am, who lived that we might be loved, and died that we might have peace and joy now and forever, we pray. Amen. All right. The methodology for tonight, we will first of all just ask, after you have filled in the questions for Unit 4. Keep trying to call it a chapter. It's really a unit, according to our author. If you filled in those questions after our run-through, then I'm going to ask if there are any things that didn't get filled out that you had confusion or questions about, and we will answer those before we go on to our overview of Unit 5. And tonight I might warn you a little bit, there's a lot of reading along with my reading of the scripture this evening so that we can get some highlights of what's going on and what connections we need to make. So first of all, let's go over Unit 4, see if there's anything lacking in your filling out of those questions and things that were happening with that unit workbook page from page 11 and following.
I didn't have any questions. Everything was really spelled out in the book and in the chapters that they cited.
Okay, so if we're good on that, we can go ahead then with Unit 5. And the methodology is this. We go over the unit in class. You take your workbook and then go back and fill in the blanks in your workbook, and that will cement in your mind the things that we have discussed in class, and then you have a record of the class lesson in your own handwriting with your own answers, or the answers that you derive from the rest of the class. That's how we're doing this. Excuse me, I've had a bit of a cough, so I'm going to pop in a cough drop and then head out. If you look at tonight's lesson, this is a repeat of a graphic illustration we've already had. It shows the pattern of sin, judgment, and God's grace, which we got in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And as you go through it, you see at the top there in color the picture of Adam and Eve and what God intended from the beginning. And all that from the time of Eden, through all of those circles of sin, you see the symbol for sin is all the way through there. God's grace was distilled down to a particular couple, Abraham and Sarah. But the promise was made directly to Abraham. And this is something you probably want to write down in your book somewhere, but this was a covenant of divine obligation. In other words, God is the only one who made a promise here. But later on in Genesis, and with Abraham, we also have not only the promise of divine obligation, but also of human response. And that comes in the form of the covenant of circumcision, which we'll get to just in a little bit. So there's divine commitment, and then there's human obligation. So covenant of divine commitment is what was given to Abraham to make him or give him a land, offspring, and to be a blessing to the nations. That's the covenant, and we'll talk more in detail about that covenant very soon. And also, we want to see that this is grace embodied in this one person and his descendants. It is to make a special people who would be a light for the rest of humanity, and that was God's plan after the fall. That there would be one man and his descendants who would be a shining light, an example, after they had this, I would call it a strong relationship with the one true God. And they would be the shining light to the rest of the world, who would be drawn to their light like a moth to a flame. Then we see there was all these sin things that happened. We had the fall, which brought about death, and the grace was God's providence or presence in their lives. Then we had the first murder, and then after that sin, the consequence was the mark of Cain. We go down beyond that to the sin of the sons of God. They were called heavenly beings, angels, if you will, who had relations with humans. And then finally, it was the one of Babel, which was the sin of really going back to original sin, of wanting to be like God and build a tower to the sky and taking control of heaven. And that ended up in destroying the tower, confusing the language, and Babel dispersed people all over the world. And then there was the flood, and out of the flood, on the other side of the flood, Noah and his descendants boiled down to this one singularity, if you will, called Abraham. It was the scandal of singularity, of grace was to come through this one man, a man that was 100 years old, his wife was 90 years old, they had no heirs, and yet God promised to give them descendants more than the stars in the sky and more than the sands of the sea. And it is through him and his family that we get redemption by God's example through that special people that was formed, starting with Abraham and his family. Then we can see all these things that happened. All the sin circles up there. Sin brought about death. Sin brought about separation and wars. Sin brought about a break-in from the heavenly realm into the physical realm. Sin, and then also we have the sin and of arrogance, if you will. At Babel, they thought they could make their way up to heaven and storm the gates of heaven and take control of God's creation. It was the idea that man had anything in his own limited way that he could offer in place of God's plan. And we'll see that more tonight through Abraham and his own family even. So, now this gives you the family tree. This is on page 70 in your student book. And you can see we start with Adam. To the left we have other sons and daughters. To the right we have Seth, who was the replacement for who?
King.
Abel. All right. And it is through the line of Seth that we get to Noah. Noah was one of the few righteous people left on the earth. And then we have the flood and the flood aftermath.
I do have one question that kind of goes back, and it's not going too far back.
Question?
It asked who, after Noah gets drunk and the naked thing with Ham, and he curses Ham, but he only gives a blessing to Shem, and who's not the oldest.
Right.
And I know the law wasn't existing then, but why did Shem get it, not Japheth?
Well, that's a good question.
Okay.
We're just going to have to ask when we get up there with God.
Okay.
The only thing we do know about Japheth is that he did produce Rachel, who would later be the wife to Jacob. Of course, Leah came in between that, but we'll get into that later in our talk tonight. But the idea here is that all the Semite peoples, and you know the word anti-Semitism, Semites are all the Jewish races. And it is through here, through Father Abraham, that we have the line that gives us the Israelites, through Isaac, and then through Jacob. And Jacob, of course, was renamed Israel, he who strives against God. And Jacob had 12 sons, which became the progenitors of the 12 tribes. So we can follow the family tree through that line, from Seth to Shem to Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, and then we have the nation, the Israelites. And we have some precursors to all this happening, of things happening now that would happen later. And it's very interesting to see that as we get past chapter 11 and into chapter 12 and following, what actually takes place. And of course, we'll get into this next, is the whole idea of the covenant that God made and sealed it with a very special ritual. You see the symbol for God is up in the upper left-hand corner. And Abraham is there on the right, the stick figure. And what God was doing is saying no to these false idols, these gods and goddesses. You see little carved figurines there on the left. He's saying no to them. This is a living God. And he made a covenant with Abraham in a certain way he would understand, and reiterated his promise of land, offspring, and to be a blessing poured out on the nations. So let's go back and pick up our story in the Bible tonight. As we get to the end of chapter 11, we are introduced to Abram, which was Abraham's name given at birth. Now the name Abram, loosely translated, means father, and Abraham means father of many. So he had the designation of being father at the very beginning, and he came from Terah. And Terah, going back to this, was a carver of house idols. Some people have home altars they set up for worship and devotion purposes. Well, in the pagan religions, there were often little altars set up to these various gods and goddesses, and they would need carved images, and that's the business that Terah was in. Very interesting that Abraham was part of a family that made gods and goddesses for other people. But we do find out that Abraham had an unusual trait. And let's read through, starting at chapter 12, verse 1, to find out about Abraham. It says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." And very simply it says in verse 4, so Abram went, as the Lord had told him. He hears this voice of God and obeys. That is Abram's unusual trait, that he heard the voice of God and immediately obeyed. And as it says in Hebrews, and as we will read later in Genesis, it was accounted to him as
righteousness.
Yes, right, righteousness. And what is righteousness?
Being right in front of God.
Yeah, being right in God's eyes, rather than wrong. It's not the left and right, it's right as being correct in God's eyes. So he was righteous. He was on the right side of God in his obedience. So he's leaving everything he knows in his father's realm of influence, and he's saying to Abram to go to a land that I will show you. And he's going to make of him this promise of becoming a great nation, that he will be blessed and be a blessing. So in verse 4 it reads, so Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Who's Lot?
His nephew.
Yes. Remember Haran, his brother, his oldest brother, died, and they named the place after his brother. And this is Haran's son Lot, Abram's nephew. And so Abram and Lot are going together here. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Verse 5, and Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to a place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Now this is the first time that we have this idea that Abram actually had a vision of God. Before this, it just says that God spoke to him and he obeyed. Well, now we have God had appeared to him, and because of this, Abram decided to build this altar. And so he appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he had passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oath of Moreh, and he was in a land of foreigners, a bunch of Canaanites. Okay? So, coming from Ur of the Chaldeans, or Babylonia, as we know it, he was coming to a different group of people, a different tribe. And this tribe, if you go back, came from the descendants of Ham. Ham, who was basically cursed by Noah for the incident that happened when Noah got drunk. So we know that the Canaanites filled the land after the flood, and that now we're going to see a change will take place as Abram goes on his odyssey through the land of Canaan.
So Ham is Abraham's great-great-uncle.
Yes. Great, yes. So all the wealth that Abram had, his nephew Lot, and all the wealth that he had, they combined and they were together with this. They had servants, they had concubines, they had herds and flocks and all this kinds of stuff. And they left the place and entered the land of Canaan. Now look at verse 6. Abram passed through the land and he came to a place at Shechem. Shechem is a place in the land where you can see you're outside of the Transjordan area, but entering into the Canaanite territory. So that's where they were entering. And at that time they were in the land. It says, verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." And so Abram builds his altar. Verse 8, from there Abram moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And remember, whenever we see L-O-R-D in all capital letters, Yahweh is behind that, and it's translated loosely, I am. All right? And verse 9 says, and Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negev. What is the Negev?
The desert.
It is the desert. And so he is going through desert places. I will postulate to you that Abram, writ small, writ individually, is representing what would happen years later with Moses and the people of Israel when they came out of Egypt. So that's what he's doing here. So he passed through all these places, and now in verse 10, now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt. Does that sound familiar? Sure it does. It would happen with Jacob's family later. Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. Let's stop there. The woman is old. She's like 70 years old, right? And so we have this woman who has really kept her looks all this time. He says she's a woman beautiful to look at, beautiful in appearance. Verse 12, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. She wasn't a sister necessarily. she was maybe a step, but here you go again. He wasn't really lying, but he was. All right, so he didn't want to lose his life, but he was going to use this ploy to gain an advantage. So he says, say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. 14. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. 17. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai. Plagues? Pharaoh, does that sound familiar? Yeah, it does. And so, this is verse 18, Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go." And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So he gained some wealth from Pharaoh, which would be echoed later on down the line when the Hebrew slaves left Egypt. They would leave with great wealth. Get out of here. We don't want any more of your plagues from your God. Get out of here. So that's basically what's going on in this. You have an echo that's going to show up later on. All right, 13. So Abram went from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. Now they're going into a more arid desert place, right? The Negev. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. So here they are in this sparse land, and it can't support all their animals and all their people and all that it was doing, or else they both end up starving. So they decide to split up. And Abram has this idea, and Lot, who went with Abram, has to choose now where he's going to go. And there was strife, it says in verse 7, the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Verse 8. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley. In other words, he chose the good stuff, all right, for himself. And Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. So that's setting the scene for something that's going to be coming up down the line here. So we know that this is a very wicked place. Verse 14, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. This past summer, a group of us from the church went to Hebron, and we saw how you could see the great expanse of lands that were all around that valley area, and it was quite impressive. It gave quite a vista. You can't even imagine the stark beauty of the land unless you go there. Pictures don't do it justice. You get a real panoramic view from up there, and here we have it right from Scripture. God is showing the place to Abram, that he's going to give this to him and his descendants forever. And the thing is, as Abram travels in this, and if you pay attention to the place names, he's kind of marking off the territory. He's walking the borders of what we will know as Israel later on in history. And he's more or less marking his territory by walking around this land. All right. Now, Lot gets into trouble. And there's these little city-state kings in these various places in the Palestine area. There's all these little city kings. It says, in the days of Araphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim. These kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zor. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. Now, like I said, a group of us from the church went to the Holy Land this past June. And when we got to the Dead Sea, and of course we played in the water and saw how we could float so well in the water and everything. But where is the Dead Sea situated? In a valley. And that valley is below sea level. And we know that this whole place where this war is taking place, the war is going to take place in the valley. Because it's pretty hard to fight in the hills. So this is what's going on. So verse 4 says, 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. Now this is the whole case of these stronger kings. They would have vassal states, vassal kings under them. The stronger king was called a suzerain. The vassal kings were under his thumb, so to speak, and they had to do whatever he said and agree to the taxes and the tribute that he would exact from them. And now they're rebelling. They're rebelling. So they were ready to be done with him. Verse 5, in the 14th year of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Kardaim and Zuzim in Ham, the Enim in Shaveh, Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. 7. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. Now these words are tongue twisters, I understand, but they're just as plain to the Arab-speaking peoples there as any place name is to us. Verse 8, then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out, and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim, with Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goim, Amraphel, the king of Shinar, and Arioch, the king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. Verse 10. Now the valley of Shittim was full of bitumen pits. What is bitumen? Tar. And they would dig this out in chunks and make deep pits. And when you heat it, it turns into almost an asphalt, tar-like substance. It's what Noah painted on the gopher wood he made the ark out of. God told him to seal it with bitumen. And this bitumen was used for mortar, it was used for water, as a water sealant. And so there's all these pits where the bitumen had been dug out. So there's all these bitumen pits. And it says, as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. 11. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their provisions, and went their way. 12. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. So now here's Lot, who's been captured in this time of battle, and all of his stuff has been taken away. And it says in verse 13, then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew. This is the first time we get a mention of the word Ebaru. Ebaru was an Amorite term for mixed race people. Mixed race people. All right? So he was Abram, the mixed race people person. And it's interesting that he's called a Hebrew at this point. Okay? So Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. 14. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. That's a place name. As far as Dan. 15. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. 16. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot and his possessions, and the women and the people. So Abram had a great victory in his battle. So what does he do? He praises God, and he goes to somebody that he knows worships God Most High, and that is the priest and king Melchizedek in the town of Salem, which later would be known as Jerusalem. Okay? So after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out what? Bread and wine. Oh, that sounds familiar. Here he is in the valley of the kings. And what does Melchizedek bring out? Bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And this Melchizedek, this kingly priest, blessed Abram and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. A tenth, we know later, is called a tithe. And that tells us that he was giving an offering of all that he had. And then in verse 21, we have this, that's the king of Sodom said to Abram. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. All that he had rescued, the king of Sodom wanted the persons. Now we know what happens in Sodom later. They're in the flesh trade. And so, give me the persons, he says, and keep the goods for yourself. 22, but Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. You see, Abram didn't want to be beholden to anyone. He wanted to make sure that no one could say, well, I put him in that place of, and that somehow Abram would then owe him. No, he wasn't going to get into that trap. So he says in verse 24, I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share. Those were the other kings who were now enjoying the plunder of that rescue. So that is an important part of this as well. All right. So as we go through this, in chapter 15, we already saw that God had his covenant of divine commitment to Abraham. Now there's going to be a covenant of human obligation, the first one ever talked about, other than God warning Adam and Eve not to eat of certain trees in the garden. Now there is an actual covenantal action that goes on, and here is how God seals the deal. All right? So chapter 15, verse 1, read along with me in your Bible translation. It says, after these things the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Quote, fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. Verse 2, but Abram said, O Lord, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be their heir, or will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. So there's the promise, okay? And he brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and number the stars if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he, meaning God, counted it to him as righteousness. So here is a strong case for faith, not works. Just being obedient, having faith in God that God's going to work it all out. And here is Abram, now listening to God and believing him. Verse 7. And the Lord said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. Not unlike what happened off of Sinai. Years and years and years and years later, when God said, I am the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the bondage of slavery. This is God telling Abram who he was and what he was going to do. I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur, that's the city of Chaldeans, namely Babylonia, to give you this land to possess. Verse 8. But Abram said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? Verse 9, he said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down, you know, the hawks and the eagles and the buzzards were trying to get at these carcasses, okay? So he said, when this happened, the birds of prey came down on the carcasses. Abram drove them away. This is all during the day. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Well, we know what that is. That's the time of slavery in Egypt, God's people. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. And we know that they did. By the time that the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, took place, Pharaoh was ready to get rid of these Hebrews, get them out of his land, and here, take this stuff with you. Don't ever come back. Okay? So they left with great possessions. Verse 15, as for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. And here we have a representation of the smoking pot and the flaming torch, which is reminiscent, well, not reminiscent, but speaks beforehand of the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night that led the Israelites out of Egypt into their crossing of, or to their crossing of the Red Sea. It was a symbol of the presence of God. What did they see on the top of Mount Sinai?
Lightning and thunder.
Yeah, there were flames, there were smoke, there were rumblings, and so this whole idea of smoke and fire is a symbol for the presence of God. And this burning torch and this smoking ember pot are going between these cut apart pieces of animal. And it was a way that one made a covenant and sealed it with an oath. It was saying, as God, in this symbolic way, passed through these cut apart animals, he's saying, let what happened to these animals happen to me if I go against my word. And that's why Abram witnessed this in his trance, his deep sleep. Excuse me. Okay, so it's not unlike the old saying when you were a kid, you know, cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. Well, here, God says, let what happened to these animals being split apart happen to me if I don't keep my word. And that's what happened. And then it says, on verse 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land from the river of Egypt. What river is that?
Nile.
The Nile River, right? To the great river, the river Euphrates, which is to the east, north and east, and the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, and the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Whew! All a bunch of ites. And it is the Jebusites who would conquer the city of Salem and build its walls for protection. And the city of the Jebusites would become Jerusalem, which means Salem of the Jebusites. Excuse me. All right. So this covenant of not obligation, but commitment, divine commitment, precedes the covenant of human obligation, which will come very soon. Now in chapter 16, we have the great story of Sarai trying to solve God's problem for him. She's not having any babies. So she says to her husband Abram, "Here, have my handmaid Hagar, and have babies from her to be your heir." And from that union came Ishmael, who was later described as the wild ass of a man, who was also the father of all the Arabs. Okay? The progenitor of all the Arab peoples. So that's why there will never be any peace in the Middle East, because both Ishmael and later Isaac had the same father and the same promise. Land, offspring, a blessing to the nations. Okay? And as happens in many families, there is a fight over that inheritance. All right? So, it says in chapter 16, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, 'Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her.'" So here's the first case that I know of surrogacy. Okay? So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. So she's going, "Nanny, nanny, boo, boo. I have a baby and you don't." It's very childish, okay? And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you." Well, she's the one that tried to circumvent God's plan, but she's trying to blame Abram about it. "I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. So she was so harsh with Hagar, she ran away. And it says in verse 7, "The angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, the spring of the way to Shur. And he said, 'Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?' She said, 'I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai.' The angel of the Lord said to her, 'Return to your mistress and submit to her.' The angel of the Lord also said to her, 'I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude.' So the promise made to Abraham, because he was the daddy of this child, transferred over to that side of the family. And the angel of the Lord said to her, 'Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen.' So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, 'You are a God of seeing.' For she said, 'Truly here I have seen him who looks after me.' Therefore the well was called Bir Lahairoi It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. All right, he's 86 years old and still a potent man. Wow. I can only dream that I will be like Father Abraham. Okay. Now in 17, this is where Abraham's name changes. And it's because he makes this, God makes this covenant with him of human obligation. We have the covenant of divine commitment. We'll have land offspring and be a blessing. And now there's some human obligation that's going to go down through the generations. Okay, let's read along again in 17. When Abram was 99 years old, this is 13 years after Ishmael was born. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. And remember what I said earlier, Abram means father, Abraham means father of many. Okay? Verse 6, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant. So this covenant's going to last forever and ever. Okay? To be God to you and to your offspring after you. Verse 8, and I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings. In other words, where you've been traveling, that's the land that I'm giving you. All the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Verse 9, and God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep. You see, there's the obligation between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring, both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So now there was this obligation on the part of God's people to have this part of their body removed as a sign. Human obligation. Well, next we get into the promise and later the birth of the son I call Laughing Boy. His name means I laughed. And so also happened to be the name of my grandfather. And so here we go. Isaac's birth promised is the next part. Verse 15, and God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. 17. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. Okay? Isaac. Oh, and by the way, Sarai's name, when it was changed, it changed her name from being merely cherished to being princess. Okay? And Isaac means he laughs. Okay, so here is Abraham laughing about this whole thing, because he's 100 years old and Sarah is 90 years old. Can you imagine someone today being 90 years old and pregnant? Wow. Okay. So, 22, verse 22 of chapter 17. When he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son and all those born in his house, and bought with his money every male among the men of Abraham's house. And he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. And there was moaning and gnashing of teeth in the tents all night long, I'm sure. Okay. And verse 24, Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. That gets us to chapter 18. And now, as he's camping out there at the Oaks of Mamre, as was his custom, he looks up in the heat of the day, because he was in his tent because it was kind of hot. And he looks up and there's 3 men there. And look what it says in chapter 18. The Lord appeared to him by the Oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. Okay, this has already told us that the Lord appeared to him, right? So, when the Lord appeared to him, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and there were 3 men. What comes to your Christian mind?
The Trinity.
The Trinity, exactly. All right? So he lifted up his eyes, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves. And after that, you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So what does this say about Abraham?
Well, I mean, he recognizes these 3 men, but he calls them one, my Lord.
Yeah, if you look at the translation, only one letter is capitalized, the
He's
L.
not saying you guys.
Yeah,
He's calling them as one.
Lord. Yeah.
He bows down and is not told not to, like when later on in the New Testament, if you bow before an angel or somebody else, he said, get up.
Yep, yep. And now he's bowing before the Lord, who is now singular. And it's in the translation, it's like me calling you Mr. or somebody calling me Pastor. It's a title. And that's all it is, it's a title.
So it's not the Lord is my shepherd type thing.
Yeah, it's more of a
Lord of the
not
Manor.
I would call it not a pleasantry, but the custom. Call someone a title. Because it's not all capital letters. If it was, it would be Yahweh. If you see there, it just has L-O-R-D.
Right.
O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. And he does start bringing stuff out, right?
And who does he think this is then?
I don't think he's sure yet.
Okay.
I don't think he's sure quite yet. Until the talk starts going to Sarah having a child.
Okay.
Yeah. But it does show hospitality was part of who he was. And it was also part of what was expected in those ancient days. If someone came to your house, you were to treat the visitor as well as you could. And that's what he's doing right here. He's giving hospitality. So they said, do as you have said. And Abram, this is verse 6 in chapter 18. And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Now, I don't know how fast you can prepare a raw animal, but he prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set it before them. So they must have spent a good part of the day there. Then he took, and then it says, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. God doesn't need to eat. That's curious. All right. Then next in verse 9, they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? He hasn't introduced them, as far as we know. Where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, she is in the tent. Then it says, the Lord, all capital letters, right? So we know. Then Yahweh said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. In other words, she didn't have her monthly cycle anymore. She had gone through menopause. She was just an old lady. Okay? And then they were advancing years. And then verse 12 says, so Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out, and my Lord, meaning Abraham, is old, shall I have pleasure? We're not talking about sexual pleasure here, folks. We're talking about the pleasure of having an heir, a child. That's what she's talking about. Because when you didn't have children, you were looked down upon in the community. And here she says, I'm going to have the pleasure of being a mother, having a child and raising that child. So she is talking about that kind of pleasure. And in verse 13, the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? He says, is anything too hard for the Lord? And once again, more clues are coming out to Abraham that this isn't just any old stranger who's wandered into his camp. This is the Lord, Yahweh. At the appointed time, he says to Abraham, I will return to you. And about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, no, but you did laugh. Then the men set out from there, and they looked down towards Sodom. And Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, Look, it says righteousness and justice. Doesn't say anything about the law. There's no law yet. Okay? So that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he had promised him. What? Land, offspring, and blessings. All right? Then the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know. So this next section is about Abraham bargaining with God because he knows his nephew Lot is down there in Sodom. So he starts bargaining. If you find, 50 righteous people, will you destroy the whole city? Then he says no. And then he comes up to God again and says, suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And God said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. And he goes on and on and on through his numbers until he gets down to 20. And he says, Lord, don't be angry. I'm going to ask you this again. Just this once, suppose 10 are found there. Okay, and that's probably about the number that was in Lot's house at this point. Okay, he answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. Okay, so God was going to destroy Sodom, but Sodom is an evil place, and these 3 apparent individuals walk in and have become guests in Lot's home, and the men of the city want to have the men brought out to them that they might know them. And if you see the word know, think sexual relations. Okay, that it was. I just can't even imagine a place like this where at every turn there's all this debauchery going on, and they're calling in when there's strangers coming to town. It says in verse 5 in chapter 19, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them. And Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not yet known a man. Let me bring them out to you. Oh, poor daughters. He's ready to throw them right under that bus, but that's what he did, okay? And behold, I have 2 daughters. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do not do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. You were responsible for anybody who came under your roof, as it says here. But they said, stand back. And they said, this fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge? Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Then they pressed hard against the man Lot, and drew near to break the door down. But the men, meaning the ones who were inside, the Lord's entourage, reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck those men outside with blindness. And we know that's that part of the story. And then those who were with Lot said, do you have anyone else here? And of course, there were men who were betrothed to his daughters who were there. And so they are telling Lot and his family, get the heck out of here, we're going to destroy the place. And Lot bargains with the Lord. There we go. All right. So with all of that, we have the stage set, and God destroys Sodom. And while they are running away, Lot's wife, in verse 26, who was behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. They weren't supposed to look back. And then Abram the next morning looks out and saw the place of Sodom and Gomorrah, and it was smoke and cinders. Looked like a furnace. It just burned it all away. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. And so we know the next story is about Lot's daughters, and they connive a way to get dad drunk and have children by their own father, which of course is incest. And I have the 1816 Bible of my ancestor, Joel Brown, who was an atheist, who had written all in the columns his notes that said, "Fine, upstanding, moral family this is!" Exclamation points. And of course, the Bible isn't condoning this. The Bible is just telling us what these people did. And we shouldn't take it as that's what God condones. So that happens in chapter 19. And then we go to Abraham and Abimelech. And the whole thing that happened down in Egypt with Pharaoh now happens with Abimelech. The same thing about him calling Sarah his sister, and him getting out of the deal with all kinds of treasure. So it says in verse 14 of chapter 20, then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham, and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you. So in other words, get out of my sight. Here's a place where you can live. And now we get finally to Hagar and Ishmael, who were now going to be protected. We have the birth of Isaac going on, and it says in verse 4 of chapter 21, and Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And at that point, Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And so we have this story of the birth of Laughing Boy. A little bit later, Abraham makes a treaty with Abimelech, and they are recognizing that Abraham has God with him in whatever he does, and there is a dispute over water, and then there's a treaty and all that good stuff. 22. The story of Abraham being told by God to go sacrifice Isaac, his one and only son. And once again, Abraham is compliant. He might have been grieved, but it doesn't tell us that he's really grieved about it. He just does what God says and takes Isaac out into the wilderness with him and says, we're going to go worship the Lord. And at the last minute, God's angel stops him, and a proper sacrifice is provided by a ram whose horns are tangled in the briars. And then God tells him that he did this. And in verse 15, and the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord. This is the angel telling Abraham what God himself is saying to him. By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So, the whole covenant is reiterated at that time of testing of Abraham, almost sacrificing his one and only son, Isaac. In 23, we have the death of Sarah and her burial, and him bargaining with the Hittites about the price of a burial plot, and they give it to him. And then after that, we have Abraham, who was a pretty old dude at this point, and he finds another wife named Keturah. And we know about that. So, Abraham decides it's time for Isaac to get married, so he sends a servant to his kindred to find a wife for Isaac. And the one that is found for him is a woman who came out to draw water. There was Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, and she came out with her water jar on her shoulder. She was attractive, and of course, Isaac, I'm sure, was thankful, because after we get through this whole narrative, she is seen from afar by Isaac, and he definitely says, yes, Daddy did good. And we come then to the end of Abraham's life. It says, Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him some, boy, he was a busy man. He had lots more sons. These became other tribes and nations. And Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts. And while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. All right, so didn't want any palace intrigue going on here, or any assassinations or anything, so he sent them all away. Abraham lived 175 years, and he died. But you shall notice, I hope, that as the timeline goes forward, the years of life diminish over the course of time since the flood. Remember, when Abraham was born, Noah was still living. And people lived to be, 700, 800, 900 years old and more. And now they were living not even to 200 and dying. There's a footnote here about, it's in parentheses in the translation, about Ishmael. He lived to be 137 years, and he breathed his last and died. So we see that the lifespan is going down to the amount that God proclaimed back in the early chapters of Genesis, back in chapter 6, when he said, my spirit shall not abide in man more than 120 years. We're getting to that point. All right. Then Isaac has twin sons by Rebekah, and we know them as Jacob and Esau. And we need to stop there tonight. If you have gone through the student book, past the sealing of that covenant of divine commitment, and going to the covenant of human obligation, that takes us all the way through chapter 25. And we have finished unit 5 and tied some loose ends together. One of the things we have to understand is, as we go back here, is that it is from Haran, then Lot, that we have Rebekah, who is then wed to Isaac. I'm sorry, Nahor. I'm sorry, I meant Nahor. which we don't have on this graph, but we do know that from Nahor, his middle brother, that we have Rebecca, who is related. She is a cousin, and she is wed to Isaac. All right. So here's the scroll with the covenant of divine commitment. I will give you land, and you see that Star of David marked at Jerusalem. I will give you land, and then there's the stick figures that represent offspring, and finally poured out as a blessing on the nations, which means the world. Okay? And we will pick up with this next week. Take your student book, and now you are more equipped to fill in the blanks that are there in the workbook. And that will be our continuing methodology throughout the course. Thank you for joining me this evening. I'm going to say so long for now, and we'll see you next Thursday at 7 p.m.